Vadina. My name is Laura Purdy and I work at Liverpulio John Moores University in the UK. I am also a senior researcher in the Institute of Educational Research at Vytauto University. A couple of weeks ago, I delivered this session online to your colleagues at Lithuania Sports Climbing, and participants were able to share their ideas and concerns. So for those who couldn't attend, I've created this video of the key topics and discussions we had. So my aim for this session was to talk about what the International Olympic Committee refers to as safe sport. So I'll discuss how these environments can be encouraged to protect athletes' quality of life, their health, safety, happiness, and prosperity inside and outside of sport. And we'll also look at behaviours and methods that might challenge this. Although I work in the UK, you might be able to tell from my accent that I'm from Canada. I have, however, spent a lot of time in Lithuania, so I do feel like it's my third home. My sport of focus was rowing, so I had the opportunity to train and race in many countries, but when I was involved in it, I was curious about some of the methods my coaches used to try to get rowers to achieve their best performances. I also looked at how coaches could design training environments that disregarded the rights and care of athletes. From this, I've spent years working with athletes, coaches, sports clubs, national federations in a variety of sports, national coach education providers, and universities to create new approaches and programs that promote athletes' welfare and safe sport. It's this topic that I'll be focusing on today. Before we start, it's always good practice to let you know if this session raises concerns and you'd like to speak to someone about them, please use these organizations outlined on this page. These are relevant to Lithuania, and you might know of some others that could be helpful as well. So, to begin, let's set the scene about sport. Sport is a priority for the majority of European citizens. It's been recognized for the positive outcomes such as fun, health benefits, opportunities to learn and interact and develop. Sport also contributes to the economy, educational achievement, productivity in the workforce, and cost savings for health and social care services. However, governments, sport federations, and the International Olympic Committee now recognize that sport may be the context for the abuse and neglect of adult and child athletes. This may result in, among many, violence, bullying, disordered eating, overtraining and injury, and withdrawal from sport. So the International Olympic Committee is now promoting safe sport, and this refers to athletic environments that are respectful, equitable, and free from all forms of non-accidental violence to athletes. So those involved in the workshops came up with the following slides. So for these participants, a respectful athletic environment is one where communication is open and transparent. Coaches are considered and thoughtful in what they do and what they say, and there is non-violent communication, but there are consequences if these processes aren't followed. It's attentive to rights of athletes. It's non-discriminatory. It's reasonable in the demands on athletes' time, energy, and enthusiasm. It promotes fair play. Coaches are positive role models so that there's no attempt from the coach to exert undue influence and pressure to obtain personal benefit or reward. So we did the same activity with regard to an equitable athletic environment, and some of the similar concepts emerged so that we champion the rights of every individual, and it's non-discriminatory, but it's also no favoritism or attention on the best performers. Third concept places emphasis on non-accidental violence, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit more to help us think more about what we see, hear, accept, and overlook in a sport environment. So I'll be talking about definitions and not looking at specific cases, but if you do feel uncomfortable with this topic, feel free to fast forward through the next few slides. So in referring to non-accidental forms of violence, I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about this study that was released in 2021. So it's called Cases, and it was a retrospective study of interpersonal violence against children in sport. So basically, the project looked at interpersonal violence against children in sport. So it focused on experiences in youth sport in particular, and it targeted Belgium, Spain, Austria, Germany, Romania, and the UK. So over 10,000 participants were engaged in this project between the ages of 18 and 30, and they had to have stated that they participated in sport before the age of 18. So they were reflecting on their experiences as children and youth in sport. And it was equally weighted for gender, male and female, and for age 18 to 24 category and 25 to 30. So as you can see from this slide, we can see what's most popular sports from the participants in the survey in terms of gender. So we've got male and female. So we've got the most popular sport and the percentage of male participants, and the total number of participants here is the N, and the same with female, the percentage of the participants, and the N is the total number of participants in that who answer that question in that way. So as we can see, the top two for male are basketball and football, so team sports, and for female, it's dance and swimming. But if we look a little bit at the smaller print at the bottom of the screen, you might not be able to see it because my head is in the way. But for majority of participants, so of the 10,000 who participated in this study, for a majority of them, for 85% of them, sport had been very good or good. And it was less than 5% who rated it poor or very poor. So let's keep that in mind as we continue with this presentation. So the project focused on interpersonal violence against children. And so some countries might use the term abuse, some might use maltreatment, but for this project, they adopted the terminology of interpersonal violence. Now, that was comprised of 4 components. So the first component is physical violence, and that refers to acts that result in the actual or potential physical harm. And in this case, because it was relating to a project on youth experiences of sport, it relates to violence or actual or potential physical harm to a child. So we know that in sport that there is a very fine line, and this is where we need to be thinking about it a bit more carefully, that there's a line which divides intensive training, and there's a line where that when you cross that becomes abusive and exploitive practices, which falls under the definition of physical violence. So this line is evident, for example, when a coach will introduce an exercise that could cause potential harm. So it could force an athlete to train when exhausted or injured. If the coach asks an athlete to partake in an exercise when there's no actual or perceived benefit, or when physical activity is used as a form of punishment. So for example, running laps, running sprints, push-ups, sit-ups, etc. as a punishment fall under the category of physical violence. So the next category we've got is psychological violence, or some people call it emotional violence or emotional abuse. And this refers to the non-physical act that causes or could potentially cause harm to the psychological health or development of a child. So if we apply this to a coaching situation, this could be subjecting children to constant criticism, name-calling, sarcasm, bullying, putting child under constant pressure to perform at unrealistically high standards. So just thinking about these two so far, the physical and the psychological, that maybe some of these traditional coaching practices that are now outdated, we can see that they would fall into these sorts of categories. We've also got sexual violence. Now, sexual violence itself is the inducement or coercion of a child to engage in any unlawful or psychologically harmful sexual activity. But you can break that into 2. So we can have contact sexual violence and non-contact sexual violence. So the first, non-contact, refers to behaviors such as verbal, visual, digital, online forms of sexual harassment. But there's contact sexual violence as well, which includes sexual behaviors with bodily contact. So sexual violence, sometimes when we see it discussed, they've split it into two. But in this case, in this project, they kept it as, they defined it as one, but we'll see slightly different data. Finally, the last category is about neglect. Now, this refers to the failure to meet a child's basic physical and psychological needs. So in a sporting context, this could include exposing athletes to undue temperatures, such as cold, heat, or extreme weather conditions, without ensuring adequate clothing or hydration, exposing them to unnecessary risks of injury as well. Okay, so those are the four categories that this project and the European nations focused on. But one thing before we start looking at the data, one thing to take forward is that with all these forms of maltreatment rarely occur on their own. So they tend to co-occur. So psychological abuse is a common denominator for other forms of abuse. So for example, maybe the physical abuse is also accompanied with psychological abuse or violence, as in the case of this study, adopting their terminology. But my aim for this was just to kind of get us aware of as to what falls under these categories, that there's four kind of main categories of violence that are typically underpinned or addressed in international and national definitions. There's these four and what they look like in sport. So moving forward, participants answered a question that answered questions in a questionnaire or a survey that related to all these forms of violence. So I'm not going to show you all the results of the survey. I've just picked out a few important areas just to get our heads around, maybe the concepts themselves, the prevalence, perpetrators, just to help introduce us to this and the prevalence based on these 6 nations of what over 10,000 people said about their experiences as children and young people in sport. So if we look at this slide, this is the prevalence of categories of interpersonal violence against children inside and outside of sport. So we could compare, whether there's certain forms of interpersonal violence that occur more frequently in sport or if they occur more frequently outside of sport. So the darker, the more solid color refers to inside sport, and the lighter color refers to outside sport. So those fall under these different categories of psychological, physical, neglect, non-contact sexual violence, and contact sexual violence. So as we can see from this, that the highest prevalence is psychological abuse or psychological violence in sport. And I think some people might find this quite surprising because we don't see much evidence of this in the media or hear it in discussions with others. One of the reasons for that is that oftentimes people don't recognize what falls under this category, or they might dismiss it as this is normal in sport, this is something that we always see in sport. So they dismiss it because it's within sport, whereas they wouldn't tolerate this in other contexts. But it still falls under the category of psychological violence. So that's a really important take-home message. But we can see, and I think what maybe we take from this is there's nothing that scoring is 0. So that for all of these 10,000, just over 10,000 participants who completed this study on their experiences of sport as young people, all of these forms of violence appeared. So this is a message worth thinking about. So I wanted to include this these graphs to show another kind of incident. So with the data on interpersonal violence against children inside of sport, it's broken it down by category. So they have a total number at the top here in purple. Then they have psychological, physical, neglect, non-contact sexual violence, and contact sexual violence. So we can see it in terms of the order of prevalence. But what they've done in this one is they've split it in terms of male and female experiences. So for the stripy lines, that's the female experience, whereas the solid line is the male experience. So according to these data from this retrospective questionnaire, that we've got a higher prevalence in terms of males. So it's still happening for females in the sport, definitely. But as you can see, when the people completed the survey, it was males reporting more incidences of these forms of violence. So that might surprise some viewers, because you might assume that maybe females are more vulnerable in sport, vulnerable to maltreatment. So another thing I wanted to point out was the level of sport and the prevalence depending on level. So as we can see on this slide, we've got the recreational, club, regional, national, and international. So we had participants representing all of those areas. And as we can see, that there's no area that's immune to violence in sport. But we can see as we go up the levels that this is increasing as sport becomes more serious, or as it reaches kind of the more competitive elite level. So we know that from other research as well that this is more like abuse and maltreatment or violence in sport is more prominent as you go up the levels, and it's particularly what they call the state of imminent achievement. So when you're on the cusp of the elite level. So some scholars have problematized this, saying when the high stakes of nearing the top level might relate in more of a compliant athlete, or consequently an athlete that's more susceptible to harm, which is why we might see more incidences, or more prevalence, the higher we go in the system. So that's something to think about as well. There's no level that's immune, but we see greater incidences as we move up higher. Okay, I appreciate I'm overwhelming you with these data. I tell you, we're nearing the end of it. But what I wanted to point out in this particular slide is this relates to the role or the position of the perpetrator who is committing the violence. So when athletes reflected on their sporting experiences as children and young people, they pointed to particular perpetrators who were causing this violence. And as we can see from this slide, we've got neglect, psychological violence, physical violence, non-contact sexual violence, and contact sexual violence. We can see in all of these categories of violence a very common pattern. So if we look at dark blue here, that refers to peers that they knew. Okay. The red one, which is also high for most of them, is peers that they didn't know who were under the age of 18. And then the turquoise refers to coaches. So we have other people within that sport entourage or that sports net as well in this picture. But I think the top three for all of these forms of violence are peers that they know, peers that they didn't know, and the coach. So this is helpful because it says that we need to probably be more alert in terms of now we understand what these definitions of violence are. So now we kind of understand what this means, but now we can start to see, well, who are the common perpetrators of this? Not that that they're doing everything, because we still have like the physios, other sport professionals, known adults such as parents and spectators, unknown adults, these people as well who are involved in this sport space, who are also perpetrators of violence. But we can say that, you know, knowing that the teammates, the tournament structure where we've got teams mingling, things like that, that maybe we need to be a bit more alert as to behavior. Maybe we need to have expectations of behavior better communicated, and also about coaching, so that people are more aware of what constitutes violence in sport, and maybe this will start to reduce the incidences. So this is purely a slide that just says, okay, it's not one particular person that we need to be looking at. It's several people who are common perpetrators. So from the data I've shared with you, we can see that non-accidental forms of violence, so those are the words of the International Olympic Committee, specifically in sport, it's a serious and widespread problem. So we also need to recognize that interpersonal violence in sport doesn't stop at the age of 18, even though that survey did stop. Okay? So on the basis of this analysis, interpersonal violence against children in sport persists in all 6 countries involved in the study. So there is no reason to believe that this is specific to these 6 countries alone. So what is happening in Lithuania? What do we know about Lithuania with respect to safe sport? So there was a study undertaken on peer-to-peer bullying and harassment among sports participants in 2019. In this project, bullying and harassment were recognized as aggressive behaviors causing harm to a person or group of individuals. So the researchers in this project invited over 1,400 participants between the ages of 16 and 29. 31 sports were represented, and these were categorized into individual sports, which was 23% of the participants, combat sports, which was 4.1%, and team sports, which were the majority of 72.1%. 73% of the participants were male and 23% female. So the findings of this survey, so of over 1,400 participants in various sports in Lithuania, they found that bullying and harassment was present in all sports. The researchers found almost 1/3 of team sport athletes reported that they had experienced this form of maltreatment. And similar to the cases data, the source of this, most prevalent, the common source of bullying harassment was their peers, so their teammates or opponents. So I think some of these data echo what was found in cases, so the 6 nations, in terms of there is bullying and harassment within sport, so that could fall under categories of psychological violence, physical violence, possibly sexual violence. It depends on these forms of bullying harassment, but they're aggressive behaviors causing harm. So if we're trying to compare it to the cases data, we can see that there is prevalence of bullying and harassment in sport. So there is prevalence of forms of violence within sport in Lithuania, particularly in team sports, and the perpetrator was mostly the peers, but probably not exclusive to that. So it's something to think about as well in terms of what's happening in the sport system in Lithuania. So a useful question to ask is, why is sport unsafe? Now, children have been identified as particularly vulnerable to maltreatment in sport because they have a different social status to adults, which gives them limited power. So there's a hierarchical difference between an adult and a child, that they'll listen to the adults, these types of things. But sport is also a culture where conforming to potentially damaging norms and behaviors is often expected, if not celebrated. So, for example, like athletes are often taught not to question the authority of the coach and others who have assumed expertise. So these people might position themselves as the gatekeeper, those who can enhance, restrict, or terminate the progression or the careers of these athletes or players. And this results in the coach control and athlete compliance with potentially abusive training regimes and methods and objectifying practices. Another issue that maybe promotes maltreatment in sport is that coaches may promote ideals of mental toughness and physical preparation that encourages risk-taking, playing through pain and injury, these stereotypical traditional views of masculinity and what is expected to quote unquote be a man, these types of things, that these ideals aren't helpful within sporting spaces. There might also be a win at all cost approach, so that they neglect the welfare of athletes in order to go for the win the tournament, win the league, whatever. So one of the concerns here is that these are familiar reasons, and scholars for decades have been finding with this within sport cultures as a way of justifying their these abusive of practices. So one concern is that they're justifying these as a dominant model of success, that people must go through these things in order to be successful, which we know from research now is that's not the case. But I think people have bought into this idea that they have to go through these types of approaches, that they're not only going to lead to improve performance, but they're the only way to get to improve performance. So hopefully you can see the difference in what I've said there, that the people maybe believe that this is the only way you can create a champion, that champions can only be made in this particular approach, which is subjecting them to different forms of violence, as in the cases data, or abuse or maltreatment. So we know that that's not the case, that's not true, but we do know that this is kind of a strong belief that we have to break down in sporting spaces. So we've gone through kind of recognizing different forms of violence or abuse and maltreatment in sport. We've looked at a bit at the frequency, we've looked at maybe the levels where we're more concerned, we've looked at who are the common perpetrators for abuse and maltreatment, but we also need to think about the consequences. So all forms of maltreatment can have devastating short and long-term physical, social, behavioral, educational and psychological consequences for those who are affected. So we know that athletes have reported feeling guilty, feeling stupid, feeling worthless, upset, angry, depressed, humiliated, fearful, hurt, inferior, lacking in self-confidence, just as the result of these behaviors from their coaches. This sort of treatment of athletes can lead to their lifetime of loss of trust, dropout, legal challenges, reputational damages, loss of sponsorship, etc., etc. And the consequences, and I think this is an important message as well, that the consequences are dependent, so the person's response to this treatment, so the consequences on them, it depends on the degree of frequency and severity. So the frequency of it and the severity of it to which it's experienced, rather than the type. So it's not like the particular form of violence is going to elicit more serious responses. It's the frequency and severity to which they experience these forms of violence. And that's maybe more what dictates the consequences. One of the things we need to think about now, particularly that there's growing awareness globally with athletes coming out, sharing their experiences, with more organizations introducing initiatives in this area, with education programs, is that abuse might not be recalled until adulthood, when through the sense making, through understanding maybe what's happened, through seeing definitions. So that's something to consider as well in terms of how we support individuals, where they can go to report these experiences. So that's something maybe federations can look at. So this brings us back, I suppose the last sentence I said was that, where people can go to report these concerns. And I think this is really a really important and critical moment to identify how we report and how we encourage people to report and how they will feel comfortable to report incidences of violence or just concerns. So they don't need to have evidence, they can report a concern about a particular athlete, a coach, or whatever. But I want to highlight this. So looking at the cases data and bringing into some other data as well, I'm just going to put some numbers on the screen and explain them to you. So in 2018, 2 academics in the UK submitted a freedom of information request. So they were asking to find out, what types of abuse had been reported in sport. And then that was the data was released to them. Okay. So in 2018, this was reported. So when people would go to the authorities to report concerns about abuse and maltreatment in sport, 47% of the cases that were reported related to sexual abuse. 19%, so big jump from 47, 19% related to physical abuse, and 3.5% related to emotional or psychological abuse. Okay, so bearing that in mind, that the people who went to the authorities to go through the process of reporting this maltreatment or violence in sport, that was sexual abuse was 47% of the cases that were reported. Okay, if we look at that cases data, so the project of the 6 nations, and we look specific to the UK because the reported incidences, these data on your screen, relate to the UK, we can see that in terms of sexual abuse, if we kind of find a similar, because again, they're using different definitions, so we have to kind of try and get like for like, but they're not exact. But in terms of sexual violence, it was 17% of a prevalence, okay? So 17% prevalence got 47% of the reports, okay? Physical violence, so the cases data says in terms of prevalence, it was 44% for UK people who completed the questionnaire. In terms of reported cases to authorities, they made up of 19% of those reported cases. And psychological violence made up 3.5% of the cases to authorities, but the prevalence was 66%. So we can see a discrepancy in terms of the prevalence and what's being reported. So the things that are highly prevalent aren't being reported, but they'll report what's low, like the smaller prevalence, although serious as well, very, very serious. So we see the discrepancy. They reported the sexual abuse, but rarely reported emotional abuse, but emotional abuse was the most prevalent in their sport experiences. So we can talk a lot about reasons for that in terms of recognition of emotional or psychological violence. The normalization that people think, oh, this is normal to have these types of this type of interaction in terms of shouting and belittling and all criticism, things that's just normal in sport, so that they don't view it as unusual or a form of violence. So again, this is what we're trying to change our thinking and help people see this, that it is a form of violence, and as coaches maybe think more carefully about what we're doing with potentially with the people that we're working with, also their languaging as well. So I think this slide was really, really helpful to show that the prevalence is high, but the reporting is low. And that's something to think about moving forward. Okay, back to these cases data. So back to that 6 nations data. And the reason I brought this on, because it relates to reporting again. So if we look at the data of those 6 European nations, and we see the blue, so we've got neglect, we've got all the different forms of violence again, and blue refers to didn't report. So they were asked if they reported their the experience, and blue is they did not. I think red refers to reported to a family member, turquoise is a friend or a player, green health worker, all the way down. But the big message here is that we've got 10,000 and something people completing a survey about their experiences in sport as young people and children, and they experienced maltreatment, or in this case violence, but they didn't report it. So for all categories, if they did report it, it was likely to be a family member or a friend, so someone outside of that sport context. So again, I think we've defined, like we've drawn attention to the different categories of maltreatment. We've seen the prevalence across 6 nations. We've looked a little bit at it in Lithuania. We've looked at kind of perpetrators. But I think this is quite important, because it doesn't matter if you know, but we can educate, we can change policies and practice, but if there's nowhere for people to report where they feel safe to report, then this doesn't really work. So if we're designing new systems and structures, we need to think about, well, where can people go that they will feel safe and willing to disclose these experiences. So I sort of let the cat out of the bag a little bit on the previous slide, where I'm saying, well, why aren't people speaking out about this? And there's numerous reasons, and I think you probably can think of some yourself. that they don't know where to go to make a complaint. So if we ask around, where would people go if they had to report a concern? A lot of people that I've worked with, a lot of student athletes, they've said, well, they don't know. They guess the police, but they're not fully sure. So somewhere that it's clear they need a reporting process where they can feel safe to go with their complaint. The other is why people aren't speaking up is because they don't want to jeopardize their career by being seen to cause trouble. So if they speak up against something potentially that their coach is doing, they fear they face sanctions. So this is probably why we see a lot of people who've retired from sport speaking out as opposed to people in the system. Some people feel like they have little power to make change, so that if they say something, the change isn't going to happen anyway, so they don't bother, which is something quite upsetting, really. Another upsetting point is that they might see these behaviors as normal, or that this was consensual, and so they're ignoring that power difference between a coach and an athlete, or an adult and a child. So that's also quite worrying. For those outside of the athlete-coach relationship, so parents, other coaches, so those who witness coaches may also fear retribution, so that they're being ousted, their child will be ostracized, this sort of thing. And then we've got, where do they go? They're uncertain as to where they would go, how to disclose, where to disclose, what happens. Is it going to yield a constructive outcome? Is it going to be traumatic for them to do this? So that also puts people off the process. So what happens with this? So if we've got people who aren't going to make a complaint, then we carry on with this culture of silence, and maltreatment or abuse and maltreatment in sport carries on. But more positively, what's happening to make safer sports spaces? So you're experiencing it at the moment. Awareness, education, conversations, discussions, getting people talking is helping people to kind of understand the different forms of maltreatment, what is right, what is wrong, what is normalized, things they might be blinded to because they, like we started at the beginning, think that sport is this perfect space where nothing can go wrong. We also can develop policies and processes, guidelines to back up this awareness, to help organizations have procedures in place in terms of what they recognize, how to investigate, and then what happens, what are the consequences. But a key feature in developing these policies isn't just to have kind of the board of the federation creating these policies. It's working with the people on the ground, including young athletes, so child athletes, who can also contribute to this process so that it's more democratic, less hierarchical, and we hear people's perspectives on the sporting environment. We also, as I've been saying in the previous slides, we need an independent place for people to report concerns, and some nations have created independent ombuds people, so you can go to them and then they look after the sports sector, so it's not a particular federation funding this, so people feel safer when it goes to an independent place. And there's sanctions, so people who are not promoting safe sport are removed, so that they cannot go to other sports, they cannot go to other nations, whether this is a networking within particular sports, because we know that, you know, within the climbing community, you have networks all over the world, that you know, if coaches are, or whoever, administrators are unsafe, then that they shouldn't be able to work within the sector. So some sort of action in order to remove people as opposed to allowing them to stay in these spaces. So we're nearing the end, and hopefully you're still with me, and also enjoying this little journey where we're kind of thinking about maybe some issues within sport, how to resolve them. But I think what ultimately our aim is, if we're mindful of safe sport, regardless of level, as coaches and athletes and administrators, ultimately what we're trying to do is promote athlete welfare. And this is the protection of athletes' quality of life, their health, safety, happiness, and prosperity inside and outside of sport. So I really like this definition because it reflects safe sport, but it gets us to think beyond the short-term performance of an athlete. So it gets us to consider the impact. So let's say today, the impact of today's sport experience, my methods as a coach, on the long-term picture of the athlete. So it's not about here and now in this moment, it's contributing to this positive, bright future. So their future health isn't compromised by something we've done with them now. They'll want to continue in the sport, they'll bring their kids to the sport, they'll help in the sport by being an official administrator or a coach, allowing that sport to continue. So that's the ideal. And I think that's why I really like this definition. But I also know it's also not just the coach and the athlete and that close-knit group that are responsible for this. Sports are often funded based on medal success. And what we've seen is globally that when you focus on medals, you create problems in unsafe sport practices and dangerous sport practices. So governments in other nations have spoken up. Sport in this form is not okay. To achieve medals, hard work is expected, but it must be done in a humane way. Winning, yes, but not at the expense of welfare. So I think those are quite telling in terms of the whole system. We need to start to think more differently. And we've got a compass in terms of safe sport, athlete welfare that can drive us. We know that athletes can be successful with a different model, and athletes, a happy, healthy athlete is a flourishing athlete and a high-performing athlete, regardless of level, regardless of age, and regardless of sport. So from today, we've looked a little bit at, what constitutes maltreatment in sport, and I know most of you have already, this is already on your radar, but if we can remove some blind spots, if we can help other people remove their blind spots as well to create a safer sport environment, then we can have more happy, healthy, and flourishing athletes. So my last message to you as I wrap this up is just a responsibility as a sporting community, as a sporting collective globally. We all have a responsibility to ensure safe sport. So moving forward, in order to ensure a sustainable sports sector, we need to start to action this. So thank you very much for your time, for paying attention to this presentation. I'm sorry that you missed the in-person version, and hopefully I'll get to do some more work with Lithuanian sports climbing. But thank you very much.